The night before the final sign carried a stillness unlike anything Egypt had known. It settled low across the land, pressing into homes, fields, and stone corridors. Even the air felt unusually heavy, as if creation itself braced for a turning point. Moses sensed it as he walked through the Hebrew settlement with Aaron beside him. The people watched him closely now, not with the distant skepticism of earlier days, but with a sobering awareness that their lives stood on the edge of something irreversible. The instructions had been given. Every family prepared a meal unlike any other, a meal rooted in obedience rather than understanding. Moses had heard the Lord speak earlier that day, his voice steady and unmistakable, shaping every detail of what was to come. Each household shall take a lamb without blemish. You shall mark your doorframes with its blood. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destroyer will touch you when I strike Egypt. Eat in haste, with sandals on your feet and staff in your hand. For this night I will bring judgment on Egypt and deliver my people. They selected lambs, inspected them carefully, carrying them with a quiet reverence that rose from the tension of the moment. The smell of roasting meat drifted through the air, mixing with the dust kicked up by so many moving feet. Mothers gathered flatbread, hands moving quickly as children watched with wide eyes, sensing the weight of their parents' silence. Elderly men sat near doorways, leaning on staffs, their eyes fixed on the horizon that held only darkness. Moses watched the family's work, his heart heavy with the knowledge that Egypt was about to face a night unlike anything it had ever confronted. He knew the gravity of what was coming, not because he fully understood it, but because the presence that spoke from the burning bush still hovered over this moment with an authority too deep to grasp. The lambs were not chosen for their symbolism by human minds. They were chosen because the one who shaped the heavens had marked this night for deliverance, and deliverance always carried a cost. The men moved to the doorframes, brushing the blood across the wood with solemn intent. The red marks glistened in the dim light, a silent sign that stood between judgment and mercy. The act itself carried a strange mixture of fear and hope, as though each family placed their entire history on these wooden frames, trusting the God who had kept them through centuries of bondage. Inside each home, the atmosphere tightened. Families gathered quickly, eating the meal with urgency, dressed and ready to move. Bags were tied, cloaks wrapped close, staffs placed within reach. No one knew how fast events would unfold, only that they needed to be prepared. Moses moved from house to house, not to check the work, but to feel the weight of the moment alongside his people. He saw fathers settle their families, saw mothers pull children close, saw young men prepare for a journey they had never imagined. He felt the fear hovering in their breaths, but he also saw something else, awakening courage, an ancient promise rising through generations of suffering. Egypt had tried to grind them into silence, but God had stirred them into readiness. As the moon rose high, a deeper darkness settled across Egypt, a darkness so complete it felt like the world held its breath. Inside the Hebrew dwellings, lanterns flickered softly, casting warm circles on the walls. Outside, the silence thickened, stretching across the villages, the cities, the palace. Moses stood at the edge of the settlement, watching the horizon where the shadows seemed to gather. He felt the weight of the presence again, not with the burning intensity of Horeb, but with a solemnity that shook him in ways he could not describe. Then it began. The night filled with a sound that cut through the silence, a cry rising from distant homes. It was not a single voice, not a sudden outburst, but a wave of anguish that spread quickly across the land. It echoed through streets, moved beneath doorways, climbed palace walls, filled courtyards, and shook the confidence of those who once believed themselves untouchable. Egypt's firstborn had fallen, from the poorest home to the highest throne. The land that had once claimed divine favor now trembled under the weight of divine truth. Moses felt the sound move through him like a force, not to terrify him, but to mark the magnitude of what God had done. This was the night that would divide history. It would shape the identity of his people forever. He closed his eyes, steadying himself as the cries continued to swell across the horizon. Aaron stood beside him, shoulders slightly hunched, face pale in the shifting light. Neither spoke. Words could not hold the weight of this night. Then movement broke through the darkness. A messenger ran toward the settlement, breath quick and posture frantic. Moses watched him approach, and before the man spoke, he already knew the message. Pharaoh was calling for him, not to argue, not to resist, not to delay. He was demanding that the Hebrews leave. Not tomorrow, not when convenient. Now, the time of deliverance had come. Moses turned toward the settlement, his voice low but steady as he moved from group to group. Families rose quickly, grabbing bundles, lifting children, tightening sandals. The calm urgency of obedience filled the air. There was no hesitation now. The story that began with the blood on the doorposts was moving forward, carrying them toward a freedom they had never known. The night became a rush of footsteps, whispered instructions, and the soft thud of belongings being lifted. The Hebrews moved as a people awakened from a long dream, each step carrying the memory of generations that had longed for this moment. Moses walked at the front with Aaron, feeling the desert wind rise gently, as if welcoming them into a story that had waited centuries to unfold. Behind them, Egypt mourned. Ahead of them, the wilderness stretched wide and unfamiliar. But between past and future stood the presence that had called Moses from the fire, the God who had heard their cries and now guided their feet. The journey had begun, not with triumph, but with reverence. And the sea still lay ahead, waiting for its place in the story. The road out of Egypt stretched wide beneath the fading night, the coolness of early morning brushing against the faces of a people who had carried oppression for generations. They walked with hurried yet steady steps, clutching bundles wrapped in cloth, guiding children who tried to keep up, leaning on staffs that seemed to carry more than the weight of their bodies. The moon hung low behind them, casting long shadows across the desert path, shadows that seemed to peel away the last traces of captivity. Moses moved near the front, the staff in his hand marking the rhythm of his pace. He felt the immensity of the moment press into him, not as fear, but as the awareness that every footstep echoed the fulfillment of a promise spoken long before he was born. The presence that lived within the burning bush felt near again, steadying him with a quiet assurance that guided his heart even when he could not see the full path ahead. Around him, the Hebrews murmured in hushed tones, trying to understand the enormity of what had happened. Some still couldn't fully grasp that Pharaoh had finally let them go. Others walked in disbelief, expecting at any moment to hear shouts from behind, commands to return, chariots rushing to reclaim what Egypt believed it owned. Yet none came. Only the sound of thousands of feet moving across the land, carrying a people from bondage toward a future they had no map for. As dawn rose, light spread across the plains, revealing the sheer size of this movement. Families stretched across the landscape, a river of humanity flowing toward unknown territory. Sheep and goats bleated softly as they moved alongside their owners, their shadows flickering across the sand. The blend of exhaustion and adrenaline pushed everyone forward. Even the elderly found strength in steps they had not imagined they could take. Moses looked back often, watching the long line of his people spill across the land. He felt an ache rise in his chest at the sight, an ache shaped by humility rather than pride. He remembered the quiet nights in Midian, when he believed his life would end far from the land of his birth, hidden from the story he once tried to avoid. Now he walked as a shepherd again, but this time he guided not sheep, but a nation. He carried not solitude, but responsibility. He felt the fire of Horeb still burning somewhere in the depths of his spirit. By midday, the heat intensified. The desert shivered with waves rising off the sand. Children grew restless, and parents tried to shade them with cloaks as they walked. The weight of their belongings pressed into their shoulders, and the exhaustion of years began to settle into their bones. Questions formed in minds that had not yet asked them aloud. Where were they going? How far must they travel? How would they survive a wilderness they did not know? Moses felt the murmurs before he heard them. The doubts moved through the crowd like the first stirrings of a wind. Not accusations, not rebellion, simply fear breaking through the cracks of newfound freedom. He knew that fear well. It had lived inside him the day he fled Egypt, the day he buried his past in the sands of Midian. The presence had not rebuked his fear then. It had called him through it. And Moses understood that the same presence would guide these people through theirs. As afternoon approached its height, the direction of their journey shifted subtly. Clouds began to gather where the sky had been clear moments before. Light dimmed slightly, though no storm threatened. Instead, something else formed, something that drew every eye upward. A towering column rose in the distance, made not of smoke alone, but of movement shaped by intention. It stood firm, steady, visible from every corner of the wandering multitude. A pillar. Moses stopped walking for a moment, eyes fixed on the phenomenon. The people behind him slowed as well, forming a ripple through the line. The pillar stood between them and the sky, rising higher than any tree or structure they had seen. It moved slowly, not drifting like ordinary smoke, but shifting with direction, as if it were not a product of nature, but a companion shaped by the same presence that spoke from fire. The people watched with breaths held. The pillar moved ahead of them, settling several paces in front of Moses, marking the way forward. It did not obscure the path. It illuminated it. Moses felt a deep stillness settle over him, the same stillness he felt when the bush burned without being consumed. The pillar was a sign not just of guidance, but of presence. The God who struck Egypt with signs now led his people with gentleness. The people followed. The pillar moved with them through the afternoon, its shifting form casting long shadows that softened the glare of the desert sun. Children walked more easily in its shade. Elders felt renewed strength beneath its covering. The uncertain whispers faded as awe replaced doubt. They did not know where they were going, but they understood that they were not walking alone. As evening approached, the pillar changed. The light of day faded, and the column began to glow with a new intensity, igniting from within like embers stirred by invisible wind. Its glow illuminated the path ahead, warm and steady, guiding them with a presence that did not sleep. Moses watched it with quiet reverence. The burning bush had been a spark. This was a flame stretched across the sky, a reminder that the one who called them out of Egypt would not abandon them to darkness. The Hebrews camped that night under the light of the pillar, spreading their blankets across the ground, settling children beside them, sharing small portions of food collected in haste. The atmosphere carried a strange mixture of exhaustion and wonder. The pain of Egypt's night still clung to their memories, but the glow above them softened the raw edges. They fell asleep with the pillar standing guard, a silent ancestor of the fire Moses saw on Horeb. Moses did not sleep quickly. He stood at the edge of the camp, watching the flame twist upward into the night. The wind brushed his cloak, carrying faint scents of sand and cooling stone. He felt a tension gathering in the air, not from the people, but from the story itself. Something waited ahead, something the presence had prepared him for, though he did not yet know its shape. He looked toward the darkness, beyond the pillar's glow, sensing movement not of people but of purpose. The path to freedom was never meant to be smooth. It was meant to reveal the heart of the one who led them. Moses closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. He knew the journey had only begun. Far behind them, Egypt mourned. But Pharaoh's grief was not the end of his resolve. Somewhere in the night, the embers of vengeance began to stir again, and the sea waited in silence, holding its place in a story that was about to split the world open. The next days carried the Hebrews deeper into the wilderness, following the steady movement of the pillar as it led them across stretches of sand and rock. They walked with the unfamiliar rhythm of people learning how to move free. Each morning the pillar rose in soft gray smoke, and each evening it glowed with fire that shaped the darkness. Moses felt the weight of purpose in every turn of their path, sensing that none of it was random. The presence that once burned in a bush now towered before an entire nation. Whispers rose among the people as they noticed the direction shifting again, bending them toward a land where the wind tasted of salt. The terrain grew harsher, the air sharper, until the vast blue of a sea spread out before them. Waves rolled in slow, steady breaths, stretching wider than their eyes could follow. The people clustered behind Moses, confusion settling over them. Freedom had brought them straight to an expanse they could not cross. The unease deepened when the tremor reached them. It began faint, a distant vibration moving through the sand, and dust rose along the horizon. Shapes emerged. The Egyptians were coming. Pharaoh's grief had hardened into vengeance, and he drove his finest chariots into the wilderness to reclaim what he believed belonged to him. The earth shook under their approach, horses charging, wheels cutting into the ground with brutal precision. Fear tore through the Hebrews, raw and sudden. They turned toward Moses with eyes wide from panic, trapped between the sea in front of them and the thunder of chariots behind. The sound grew louder, rolling across the desert like the drumbeat of doom. Children clung to their parents. Elders trembled. Strength drained from the people as they watched the dust cloud swell behind them. But the pillar moved. The column of cloud that had guided them forward shifted with sudden force, rising high before sweeping behind the Hebrews. It descended between them and the Egyptian army, forming a barrier thick as storm and bright as dawn. On the Egyptian side, darkness swallowed everything. Horses reared, chariots slowed, confusion spread in frantic waves. On the Hebrew side, light glowed like the quiet flame of Horeb. The people stood frozen at the edge of the sea as wind rose from the east. It cut across the water, sharp and powerful, driving waves back with growing intensity. Moses felt the presence surge inside the wind. He stepped toward the shoreline, gripping the staff that had witnessed every step of this journey. Moses heard the Lord speak in the rising wind. "Lift your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea, and the waters will part before you." The sea trembled. Waves collapsed backward, pulled away from the shore, as though the deep itself bowed in obedience. Water lifted into towering walls on both sides, revealing the seabed beneath. A path formed, wide and solid, stretching out into the heart of the sea. The roar of wind filled the air, mixing with the low hum of water held in place by unseen strength. The people stared with breath caught in their chests, all pushing fear out inch by inch. Moses stepped forward onto the exposed ground. The earth beneath his feet felt firm, marked by the presence that commanded creation. He lifted the staff slightly, not as spectacle, but as surrender to the one shaping this moment. The people followed. Thousands moved into the corridor between walls of water, their shadows stretching along the seabed as the glow of the pillar cast light into the rising canyon of waves. Children stared upward in wide-eyed wonder. Elders walked with trembling steps, gripping staffs, and leaning into the miracle surrounding them. The sound of the sea swelled beside them, deep and ancient, held back by a force greater than the ocean's own pull. The path ahead stretched far into the rising night, shimmering with the faint reflection of a sky beginning to darken. Behind them the pillar stood unmoved, guarding their steps, holding back the empire that had shaped their suffering. The Hebrews pressed forward, each step carrying centuries of longing, pain, and promise. Freedom was no longer a distant dream whispered in dark corners of Egypt. It was unfolding beneath their feet, cut through water and wind by the God who had heard every cry. The crossing had begun, and the sea, once a barrier, had become the doorway to a future only God could open.